Okay, chapter 9, hypothesis testing. Now, this is, I would say, probably the most valuable chapter in the entire semester. One of the main reasons why statistics is so valuable is because hypothesis testing is one of the most powerful tool that we have. Now, hypothesis testing is a tool. There are many components. So, what I'm hoping to do is, through this handout, put together the pieces, break hypothesis down piece by piece. So first, let's start what a hypothesis test looks like. Now, hypothesis test looks like this. You have H0. We call this the null hypothesis. And then that is some statement. And that is the statement that we want to test. Okay. Now, we also write down the alternative of that statement. Right? And now the alternative of the statement is true in the event that the null hypothesis is false. So for example, right, we have a statement. The null hypothesis will be I have COVID. Right? So that is a true or false statement. Now, if the null hypothesis is false, then the alternative must be true. I do not have COVID. Right? And so there can't be any other outcome. Right? It must this must be this must be true. Not it must be true, but if the null is false, then the alternative must be true. And then we have two outcomes for the test. We have two decisions to make. We either accept the null hypothesis or we reject the null hypothesis. All right, and that is the test. All right, we say accept, but sometimes it's also called fail to reject. All right, and so for example, right, if you go out and get a COVID test, you are indeed doing a hypothesis test, right? And the goal, we could. You could think of it as every swap that you're doing, you are trying to reject this hypothesis that you have COVID. And if there is enough evidence to reject the null hypothesis, then you can support the fact that you do not have COVID. Right? Let's think of another statement. Right? We have the null hypothesis. We can say that the income, a particular income is greater than or equal to 75,000, right? Then the alternative will be, well, the income, all right, must be less than 75,000. Okay, so again, if the null hypothesis is false, then the alternative hypothesis is true. Now, the null hypothesis is going to be the hypothesis that we are always testing, and that is the goal of the test is to test the null hypothesis. Now, given that we have two results, we either accept or reject the null hypothesis, but then in reality, the null hypothesis is either true or false. Then we have four possible outcomes or realities, as I like to call it, for every hypothesis test. We have the null. So again, the null is either true or false, right? That's the reality. Now we don't know. This is why we're trying to gather evidence and test it. But the null hypothesis is either true or false, and then we can draw a matrix here, and we either accept. Right, we either accept or fail. We call it fail to reject, or we reject. Right? The hypothesis. Now, if it's a true hypothesis and then we accept it, then that's great. No problem there, right? That is a good outcome. Okay. If it's a false hypothesis, so if the hypothesis is indeed false and we reject that hypothesis, that's also a good outcome. Put a smiley face. Put a smiley face there. Okay. However, we run into an error, right? If we have one of these two outcomes. So, for example, if the hypothesis is true, okay, but we ended up rejecting it. Right? So for example, right, if you do have COVID, but then we rejected this, right, we get a false negative on your COVID test, right? That would be an error. We call this kind of error a type 1 error. Okay, a type 1 error is when you rejected a true hypothesis, and we'll indicate that with the Greek letter alpha. All right. So in previous chapters, we said that to hold on. We will talk about the meaning of alpha in later chapters. Here we are. All right. Alpha is the probability that you will make a type 1 error. Okay, so that is the probability that you reject a true hypothesis. Okay, now what if it's a false hypothesis that you should reject it but you fail to, right? So all right, so you didn't reject the false hypothesis. Now in this case, we call this a type 2 error. Okay, and we will indicate this probability with the letter or the Greek letter beta.